Well, hello. Welcome to the Creative Writing Life podcast. I'm Paul Zeidman, and I'm thrilled to be speaking to my guest today. He is a notable screenwriter with lots of credits, and he's also started to delve into audio fiction, which I can't wait to talk about a little bit. Welcome to writer Bob DeRosa. Bob, thank you for being on the show today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. So before we get to talking about you, let's talk about maybe stuff you may have read or watched, and I'll go first just to give you time to collect your thoughts. Finally got around to watching it's on Amazon now. It's Bottoms, which is a comedy from last year. It was so much fun. And it almost like they took your standard high school story and just kind of like gave it all these unique twists involving lesbians and fight clubs. Just a lot of unexpected things, but I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a lot of fun, a lot of good laughs. And I've also still been enjoying Masters of the Air, which is on Apple TV Plus, which is their it's kind of like they've already done Band of Brothers and then the Pacific, and now it's about the pilots of World War II. And they're taking it in some directions I was not expecting because it looks like these headliner actors who are in it, their characters get killed and there's no like, oh, here's what happened to them beforehand or afterward. It's just like, they die. They're out of the show. It's like just pretty much like what it was then. So really enjoying it. I think there's 5 episodes already up, so I think they still have about 4 to go. So that's at least another month. So still really enjoying it and highly recommend it. But I'm a big World War II and history buff, so I'm biased. Bob, what about you? Anything good on the reading or watching front?
Yeah, watching wise, it was a good weekend. My wife and I are catching up on Oscar movies, and so we watched Past Lives, which is Celine Song's debut feature. She's a really successful playwright, and then she worked a little in TV, and then she wrote her first script and directed it, and it is gorgeous. It is such a beautiful film, lyrical, haunting, romantic, funny. Like it's kind of the whole package. It's been a long time since I've been blown away by a first time filmmaker like this. So we saw that, and the next day we saw the season finale of True Detective season 4, Night Country, which was written and directed by Issa Lopez, who did Tigers Are Not Afraid, which is an incredible film available on Shudder. And then she had like a break, and I hadn't heard of her doing anything. She came in, and I thought she just crushed this season. And so seeing like two a film and a television series, both by women of color, that are just incredible voices and filmmakers and storytellers. I was just so crazy impressed and jealous of both of those accomplishments. So really enjoyed those. And as far as reading, I started off the new year with, I'm sorry, looking at it over on my bookshelf, A Thousand Words by Jamie Attenberg, who's a novelist. And I actually haven't read any of her novels yet, but she started writing in like memoirs, and I love the way she writes about writing. And she has this uh I don't know what you would call it, this um fun thing she does in the summer called Thousand Words of Summer. And for 2 weeks straight, you write 1,000 words a day. And she's built a community of about 25,000 people that do this along with her. And she wrote a book kind of inspired by that, with words of wisdom from a lot of published writers. And it's a great book. And it's a little bit craft oriented, but it's more about just the life of being a writer and weathering the ups and the downs. And so I highly recommend that book, no matter where you are in your career or what kind of writing you like to do. I think there's a lot of gold in those pages.
Okay, would you kind of put that like on the same level as like Stephen King's On Writing?
It's very similar. Also, Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott, which is and just a classic, in just a book about just what it feels like to be a writer and how hard it is and how you just kind of live a life while doing it, which I think Stephen King's book does as well. So I'm a big fan of those kinds of books. I've been doing this forever. I've been specifically screenwriting for over 20 years, but I've been writing my whole life. And it's very lonely. And you're always like, am I doing this right? Do I know what I'm doing? Am I just making it up as I go along? And then you read all these super accomplished writers, and they write about their process, and you go, oh, they're figuring it out the same way as I am, as anybody is. And it brings me a lot of comfort. So I'm a big fan of those kinds of books.
That's fantastic. That kind of reminds me of like those authors who tweet out pictures like I had a book signing or I had a book reading at the local bookstore, the local library, and nobody showed up. And then they get the responses like I know Neil Gaiman was like, that happened to me when I was starting to. And it's just kind of like, doesn't matter how successful you become, all writers are still the same writer at heart.
Yeah, I totally agree. And anytime somebody like Neil Gaiman can go, you know what? I know how you feel. That just feels nice. Because he's working on a different level than most of us, and yet he still, I'm sure, has his bad days at the keyboard. So there's some confidence you can get from that, I think.
Okay, and it's called The Thousand Words, and the writer is
Oh, Jamie Attenberg.
Jamie Attenberg. All right, excellent.
Yeah, Jamie Jami, and she's got two Substacks,
Hmm.
one on craft, and her work. Like I said, I just love reading how she writes about writing. She's one of my favorite new writers for that, for
All
sure.
right, that's fantastic. Well, Bob DeRosa, let's talk a little bit about Bob DeRosa, the writer.
Okay.
As you said, you've been a professional screenwriter for over 20 years, and it also looks like you started in TV, but then kind of expanded to film.
Actually,
So,
other way around. No,
other way around.
I started in film and took a very brief, unsuccessful detour into TV, and then came back to film.
Okay. Well, let's at least get this. Let's start off with how you got your start. Like, how did you break into writing screenplays? And I guess what would you say is the script that kind of like helped open the doors for you?
Yeah, I thought about that. I've never been a fan of the phrase breaking in, and I know
Hmm.
everybody uses it, everybody talks about it. It creates this idea that there's some wall around Hollywood that we have to bust through. But then when we bust through, we're on the other side. And in reality, it's just a bunch of doors, and eventually you get in one door, and as soon as you get in that door, there's another 10 doors. You have to pick one, and maybe it's a good door and maybe not. And so that's the metaphor that I like to use. And I think that's the way it was for me and for most writers I know. There's not one, defining moment, but there's a couple of steps in a row. For me, I grew up in Orlando, Florida, and I was making short films and doing theater and improv and just being a creative person in a town that was having an amazing moment creatively. And so I made a short film called God Laughed, which was like the first kind of autobiographical thing I ever did. It was a romantic comedy about my terrible love life. And I showed that film at a local film festival, and it just went over great. We won an award, and I met an up and coming producer in the lobby, and he later hired me to rewrite a romantic comedy that he was producing, a feature that didn't end up moving forward, but we became friends. So eventually he moved out to LA and moved into like a manager track. So he was assistant for Jerry Seinfeld's managers, and then some other management companies. We had a lot of mutual friends because there's a really rich community of actors and filmmakers and writers from Orlando that have all moved out here. And so this was still kind of early. This was probably 2000, year 2000. I wrote a script called Gifted, which was probably my 12th script, romantic dramedy with a magical twist. And I sent it to him, and he called me back crying, going, "This is great. You got to get out here." So I flew out, slept on his couch for 2 weeks, and just drove around and saw all my Orlando friends that had moved out. By the end of that trip, I'm like, okay, I need to move out there. So in 2001, I made the move. And by then, Christopher had become his own manager. Like he gotten his own, they call it getting your own desk. So he was a manager at that point, and he started showing my script around. And it was kind of a small movie, and so a lot of executives they liked it, and but they it wasn't the kind of movie that a studio could make. So they were like, we can't wait till you write the studio script. And so he encouraged me to kind of re-embrace my love of like sci-fi and comic books and horror movies growing up. And I wrote this across time zombie killing script called Hatchet Club that was action-packed and scary and cool, but also with heart, as much heart as you can fit into an across time zombie killing movie. And he showed it to his boss. He was at A management at the time, and his boss showed it to an agent at ICM. That agent loved it, signed me, took it out. And it was back in the day when a script would go out and all these producers would take a various territory. So like Joel Silver took it into Warner Brothers, and somebody else took it into DreamWorks. And I went to sleep in my little Burbank apartment thinking tomorrow my life could change, and it didn't. The script didn't sell. But I think what is a common story with a lot of screenwriters, like that first script doesn't sell, but it gets you a ton of meetings. So I got 30 to 40 general meetings out of it. One of them was with an executive who also liked Gifted, and that was Naveed Makharji at Revolution Studios. And so he was like, "Okay, Bob, you're ready." And they had an open writing assignment for this kind of American version of Amelie that his boss Todd Garner wanted to produce, and Todd's now a massive producer on his own, as well as Naveed's an indie producer, still he's on one of my projects right now. But anyways, Todd hired me to write my first studio project. I wrote two drafts and it got me into the WGA. It didn't get made, but that was the beginning of my career. So I don't know exactly which of those moments was my big break, but it was sort of a cascading series of events and scripts written. And that was a several year chunk of time it kind of took to get from making that little movie to all of a sudden being in the WGA and being a working screenwriter.
Okay, actually, I wondered. I saw this list. It was like maybe on your somewhere in your bio or your Substack. Okay, you've written 38 scripts, made money from 10 of them.
Yep.
Four of those were original writing assignments. Two scripts optioned, not sold. One sold, not made. Three sold and made. Three have producers attached. Your new script is out to reps now. And oh, it was the hashtag, there are no shortcuts.
Yeah, I stand by those words. I say them all the time. I think every so many people want to be in the film business because it's an amazing business and movies and television are incredible. But I think everybody wants a shortcut. And
Mm.
so I think a lot of places that charge money, whether it's contests or mentorship programs or whatever, or colleges, they're kind of selling the idea of shortcuts of like, if you do this, we'll get you the access and we'll get you through that door faster. And maybe some of them deliver, but I think that there are no shortcuts. That even if you get a leg up because of a relationship or because you have something win a festival or something like that, it's still a long slog. It's still a journey. And even once, like I said, you get through that first door, there's 10 more doors waiting for you. And you have to be in it for the long haul if you really want to do this, is my advice to everybody constantly.
Yeah, I actually took part in a writing conference this past weekend, and part of it was doing this seminar, like the basics of screenwriting, talking about what goes into a script, but also about the mindset that you have
Mm,
to have.
yeah.
And one thing I've heard so many times, and I pass it on to every new writer I meet, it's a marathon, not a sprint. That everybody thinks, "Oh, I'm going to crank this out in 2 weeks. I'm going to sell it, and I can quit my job and move to LA." It's like, no, no, it doesn't work that way.
It
That
doesn't.
you finish the draft. Okay, now you got to rewrite it, and rewrite it X number of times before it's at least query ready, or to show to potential reps, or even consider trying to get in touch with producers, because that they will know as soon as they start to read it whether or not you've got a handle on the craft. And a lot of newer writers don't want to accept that, which has been my experience. They think, well, you just don't recognize my genius.
Yeah, it's a certain stubbornness in that mindset. And like not all the time, but every once in a while, somebody will message me on Twitter and they'll be like, "Hey, I just finished my first script. How do I sell it?" And I'm like, there's not like the screenplay store that you can put your script in. It's like, do you want a career in screenwriting? There's 100 things you have to do. And usually my first thing is like, write 5 more scripts and then we'll talk. And people don't like that answer at all. So I try to be helpful. If you, I think you mentioned that you follow me on Twitter, and I've tried to carve out a little safe niche where there's no jerks allowed. But I try to, when I'm on Twitter and I'm talking about my career in screenwriting, I try to come from a place of reality, which is like, sometimes I have good news, sometimes I have bad news, sometimes I get fired, sometimes I don't work for years, and it's never easy. Oftentimes it's transcendent and an amazing career, and I'm grateful for everything that career has brought to me. But I'm also like super conscious of the tough times and getting my ass kicked up and down this town. It's like, and I think most people don't think of that reality. They just think of I'm going to write this thing and sell it, and I'm going to get a lot of money. And it's like, that is that's like the 1% of your time, and the other 99% is struggle.
Oh, I could totally relate to that, because so many times over the years I've seen writers that I know mostly through social media that they'll say, "Hey, I optioned my script," and or they'll have some kind of great announcement, or like they came in first in a contest, and that's great. I'm thrilled for them. A little jealous, of course, because who doesn't want that kind of success? But then suddenly the news about that script fades, or they don't talk about it anymore. And like if I'm relatively close to them, I'll say, "Hey, how's it going with that script? I saw that, the one that won that contest, or, you had option." And they'll come back and say, it fell apart. The producer, it couldn't get funding, or just nothing ever happened with it. It stalled, and the studio said no. And, it's because a lot of writers are on the outside. They're trying to, as you know, we discussed, trying to break in. They're trying to establish a career. And so seeing anybody else achieve some kind of success, it's kind of like it's equal parts jealousy, it's equal parts motivation. Like, okay, that guy, that person did it, then I can do it too. And then you kind of look to them, it's like, okay, let's see what happens with them. And you hope for the best for them because you want them to succeed. And then when it doesn't, you're like, oh shit, like this is what if it can happen to them, it can happen to me. But a lot of writers aren't deterred by that, I'm happy to say. And some of them just keep pushing through and keep trying and trying, which is great. And it's just kind of like a reminder that, you can have as much success as you're going to get, but all of a sudden that can just suddenly come crashing down or stall because somebody said no, or something happened that, that is out of your control. So a lot of writers don't take that into consideration. As you said, they're looking for like, what's the magic trick? What's the secret ingredient? What's the, what's the secret part that I need to make everything work.
Yeah. And you learn pretty quickly that perseverance is one of the most important qualities to making it out here. But B, just not putting all your eggs in a single basket of that one script you wrote that maybe won a contest and you're just waiting for the phone to ring to tell somebody to tell you that they're buying it or optioning it or representing you. It's like having multiple things out, having multiple projects that you're working on. You're writing one while another one's making the rounds, while another one you're thinking about. And I mean, I've got three active projects right now and another script about to go out with a movie in post. And I feel relatively comfortable in that moment, but I didn't get any big paychecks recently. So like, I'm hoping one of those turns into, a bit of money so I can, make a living at this. So it's always like, yeah, it's like that feeling of I'm just going to do this one thing and that's going to do it for me. Now, a career is all your scripts, all your attempts, all your relationships. It's a long game, and once you've been in it for a while, that feeling of like getting jealous because all of a sudden somebody you've never heard of just sold three things in a row. You're like, well, okay, we'll see where you are in 10 years because
Or see where you are in 1 year even.
yeah, totally.
Okay, so actually, you mentioned your Twitter feed, and that there was something I saw. I remember this. It was like early December, and you had this great. It was like 22 tweets in a thread. It was about log lines, and I
Mm-hmm.
just thought what you had to say was so incredibly helpful and insightful. That you're talking about like there are two purposes to a log line. There's the internal and the external. Like one is to, I guess, sell the concepts, but one is also the marketing tool. So I was really hoping you kind of like go into a little more detail about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've always been very premise driven. Like, there's all different kinds of writers and all kinds of different ways to start. I'm a big believer in log lines and a sentence or two that distills your story down to the core of what it is. And there's a couple purposes for that. The first one is what I call internal, which means the people in your inner circle. So you're writing a log line, so hopefully you're represented. Hopefully you've got, an agent or a manager or both. If not, you've got people in your circle, your writer friends, and you kind of test your ideas on each other. And what you're doing with that log line is A, you're kind of laying out, here's the thing I'm interested in working on next. And B, you're just checking to see like, is this cool? Does just hearing a couple of sentences make you lean in and go, oh yeah, I see where that's going to go, or I wonder if this is going to happen next. Like you're kind of looking for that reaction from people, but you're looking from it like within, like with your own reps, because you want them to kind of go, yeah, I can sell that, as well as, yep, I think that'll be a good script and I think that's going to be a fun read. If you can't get that out of two or three sentences, sometimes I think you got to take a hard look at your story and go, is it there yet? And I think a lot of writers, most writers, especially early writers, start writing their scripts too soon. So I'm a big believer in writing lots of log lines and testing them on people until you get one that everybody's like, oh man, you have to write that one next. So that's the internal thing. And the external thing is then how it's sold. And so sometimes it's the exact same log line. Sometimes it's structured in a slightly different way where it's more about teasing it so that you're selling it, you're telling your log line to a potential buyer or to an agent who's thinking about signing you. And what you want is what I call the lean in, which is like they're either like, oh, what happens next? Or they're starting to complete the story for you. And you tell them a log line and they go, oh, and then this is going to happen, I bet. As soon as they start like finishing the story or playing the game of what your movie is going to deliver, that means they're hooked. That means they're in. And that's a thing that's it's hard to quantify, but when it happens, doors open for you because then people want to read that script. And so I think, a lot of people, I just read a lot of log lines that are very perfunctory, which is like this character and this happens, and then they go off and have this sort of adventure. And it's sort of like, yeah, that's a story that works, but it's not, it's kind of lacking that lean in factor. And then sometimes I'll ask somebody, what are you working on? I'm like, okay, what's this story about? Wait, let me back up. 100 years before. And I'm like, you don't know the story you're trying to tell. Or somebody writes a script and then they're trying to write a log line and they can't do it. And I'm like, if you can't write a log line based on your script might be a mess. And I hate telling people that. I hate being the bearer of bad news, but it's the truth. And I only say this out of 20 years of experience and writing probably thousands of log lines, and most of them are terrible. But a few of them are good, and a couple of them, the log line for Killers changed my life. Like that, that was I wrote that log line, and the log line for Hatchet Club, that script I mentioned earlier. That was another one that I created a log line, and both times my manager pointed at those log lines and was like, "Write that. That's going to do well for you." And both those scripts changed my life. So I'm a believer in it. It's just are you willing to commit to the practice and the hard work and the rejection of getting good at that particular skill set?
I can that rings really true for me because I mean, as many drafts of as I've done of my scripts, I've probably done at least hundreds of for log lines for like
Mhm.
one script. Just okay, does this work? Okay, no, it does. It's still like you just know that like when it hits that that's the one it has to be. And I can like even my last two scripts that I thought I had what was a really solid log line for each, and that was when I was putting on on script listings and for contests and all that sort of thing. And I guess they seemed all like 92% there that
Mhm.
they were solid, but it wasn't hitting the bullseye. It was not,
Yeah.
it was just missing the target. And I think for both of those, for one of them, a friend of mine who's a manager, she offered to just take a look at my script and said, "What's the log line for this?" And I told her, said, "Well, that's good, but it's not really, selling what the hero's story is." And so you really need to focus more on her rather than just kind of like this is what happens. And so I tweaked a little bit, and it's a lot better now. And so I took that what she had said and applied that to another script for the log line for that one, and I just kind of retooled it a little bit because what I had before was a little wordy, a little unwieldy. It was good, but it wasn't doing it for me. And so I just kind of like, okay, take a step back. What are the basics that I really have to get across here? What's the tone of the story? What's the vibe I'm trying to get across? And I probably did 10 attempts on it until I said, that's what it has to be. And so that's the one I have. And what you were saying before about like someone who goes all over the place trying to do their log line. When I was in Austin last year, because I love when I would meet somebody and just say, "Hey, what's your script about?" And they could give me the 5 second pitch, and sometimes they would give me the log line. And this one writer, he said, well, he started to go into this detailed explanation of what the story was, and I was like, you lost me after 30 seconds. I don't care anymore because you're boring me with trying to set up all the backstory. It's like, what's your script about? That's all I want to know. What's the story?
And
And I was polite about it. I said, well, okay, well, good luck with it. And then we parted ways. But I hope he took it to heart.
yeah, the always the unsaid part, the unsaid thing that follows what's your script about is what you just said. Make me care. I hope I care. And that's the job. And the thing is like that's what a good script is making you care. I said this before that like scripts are essentially passionate manifestos on why somebody should make a movie. Like you basically it's 100 pages of going, please make this movie. This is gonna work. It's gonna make you money. It's gonna make, a lot of people happy, you know. But a log line needs to be the same thing, whether it's 60 seconds or two sentences. It needs to make the person care and see the potential and want to know more. And it's not easy, but it's part of the process. And we're talking mainstream films, we're talking commercial films. Sometimes some indie movies, maybe you can't wrap it up in two sentences, but most of them, I think you can.
Okay, that's great stuff. So, okay, so we've talked about logline. So let's talk about the Bob DeRosa writing process. So you come up with an idea, or your manager says, "Hey, that logline there, write that." So, what is your starting point, and how do you develop the story from there?
Yeah, what I do, and I actually I just took I'd never taught a seminar before, and I put together, somebody on Twitter was like, "What could you teach? What could you teach for 60 minutes with no prep?" And I was like, all the pre-writing before starting a screenplay. And a friend of my writer friend of mine was like, I'd take that class. So I did a 90-minute seminar on exactly this, like my process. And the good thing was that the last script that I sold and got made, I had all my supporting pre-writing documents for it. So I was able to share that with my students. And it was a good exercise for me to just really get specific about my process and kind of lay it out so that, hopefully it could be helpful to other people. So and I'll use an example. The last script I wrote was this. I called it Wanted Man, and it's a spy movie about kind of like a government hitman who gets his orders from the New York Times wanted ads, and he just goes from job to job. He's been doing this for 20 years, and then the daughter that he didn't know he had shows up. She's now an MI6 analyst, and she's like, "Hey, your division shut down 10 years ago. Your handler's dead. Who's been giving you orders?" So they set off on a mission to find out who he's been really working for all this time. And that was the log line. It's kind of long. It's a little bit of a complex setup, but my manager looked at it and was like, this is my new manager. Actually, I kind of wanted to know what we were going to work on together before I signed with him. So I gave him some log lines, and that's the one he picked. It's like, great. So I signed with him, and because it was a new relationship, I wanted to really kind of do every step of my process without skipping any steps, because you want to skip as many steps as possible and get to the fun stuff of writing, but that's sometimes where you get into trouble. So I had this log line, for a script called Wanted Man. It's been since retitled, but my first step is I always do generally like a 2-page beat sheet, and I do a truncated version of Save the Cat. Like I knew Blake Snyder back in the day. I took his workshop. I read Save the Cat in between the first and second drafts of my script, Five Killers, which ended up becoming the movie Killers, and that changed my life. Sold for a ton of money. That script was the most successful script I've ever written. And so I've been a fan of Blake's for a long time, and I know Save the Cat takes some heat, but there's a lot of things that Blake got right. And so I love his 15-point beat sheet. I do a slightly truncated version. I do about 7 or 8 beats, but it's a paragraph for each beat and it takes me a page or two to write it up. And so I write that for every idea, and I kind of revise that until I should be able to hand that 2 pages to a colleague or to my manager, and they should be able to read it and go, "Oh, I get it. I get the movie. The themes are here. The main character, it's very clear what's going to happen. I get a sense of the sort of set pieces. Keep going." So then when I've got a beat sheet I'm happy with, I do note cards on the board. I'm like old school. I don't do a note card for every single scene, but I put about 30 note cards up on the board. I break it up into acts. It's essentially a 3-act structure, but I like breaking the second act up into 2 sections, so it's sort of a 4-act structure. But I put about, like I said, 30 to 35 cards on the board, and I'm purposely leaving some gaps in between. Like I know there's this set piece, and then we're gonna go to this set piece, and there's gonna be a little time in there that I'm gonna have to come up with a couple of scenes, but I have to leave myself a little wiggle room to improvise and kind of feel my way through the characters. But the general big beats and the big sequences and the kind of the character's journey is on that board. So again, I should be able to show that board to a colleague and walk him through it and pitch her the entire thing. So by the end, she goes, after 20 minutes, she's like, "Yep, I see that movie." And if there's anything they're confused about, they should be able to tell me anything that's not quite landing. So then after I do cards on the board, if I want, sometimes I skip this step, but with my manager, like I said, we had a new relationship. I'm like, I'm going to do everything. So I wrote a treatment, and I went from cards on the board to about a 20-page treatment, a little bit of dialogue, not too much. So it was maybe more of a scriptment, but it was just a prose document, 15 to 20 pages that laid out the whole movie in a little more detail. Gave that to my manager. He gave me notes. We kind of went back and forth. And the whole reason I do this sort of structure is every step of the way, I want to get feedback. And because if somebody's confused or doesn't quite get something, or my character's motivation is not landing, I'd much rather revise a 2-page document or 30 note cards than a 110-page script. So and it sucks. It sucks because you write this treatment and it's really hard work, and you're not going to use any of those words, and somebody's going to and you give it to somebody, they're going to have feedback. They're going to want changes because they don't understand something. So it's like, I think tend to skip these steps and try to get to the writing stuff because we don't want to do the hard work. But I've learned hard lessons over 20 years that if you skip the early stuff, you're going to pay for it later when you have a 100-page draft that's not working and you're having to fix problems in your draft. So I do as much as I can before I actually start writing. And then I'm writing drafts, and I'm still writing, I'll write 3 drafts on my own before I show it to my manager as a first draft. And then and then I write 3 to 5 drafts for him before anybody in the town sees it. The good thing is this process worked, and I sold the script. It's been a company called Film Bridge International bought it and shot it in Malta last year. We wrapped production right before the strike. Aaron Eckhart and Tim Roth and Abigail Breslin star in it. And, I got paid. I got to renew my WGA card, and movies in post-production, hopefully coming out soon. And it's also, like I said, it's just an example of like, I followed my process step by step and got to make a movie out of it. So
Has that really helped you, I guess, not only streamline your whole process, but I guess reduce the number of drafts you have to do because you're doing so much work ahead of time?
You know, I don't know if it reduces the number of drafts. It just reduces the pain of the drafts, I think. Because my goal always is that first draft, the bones of it are intact, meaning the basic structure and the beats and the overall arc of the story and the set pieces, they're pretty much set in that first draft. Because if somebody like reads a script and they're like, your second act's a mess and your third act isn't landing at all because I think you've completely started in the wrong place in your first act. Any sort of notes like that where you have to go and make massive structural changes to a script that's already been written is a living hell. So even though I may have to do a bunch of drafts to get the tone exactly right or to, get the script a little bit shorter, I'm okay with that if I don't have to re-break anything. If I'm not having to go back to the board and re-note card the board. That happened with me with Killers. Like I wrote a first draft and my manager at the time read it. He's like, this is good. You got all the right pieces, but they're kind of in the wrong order. And he gave me Save the Cat and I read it. And I was like, oh, he's right. So I reboarded it, put it all back together, wrote it again. And that script sold for a ton of money. So that was a happy ending. And that didn't take me very many drafts, but I've had other scripts that you're having to re-break stuff after you've already written it. It's just a really, really difficult place to work from and just not much fun. So at the very least, hopefully this creates a more seamless, organic process that, hopefully is not full of suffering.
Okay. You've also worked with a co-writer. So there are a lot of writers who do it on their own. So what's the process for you and your writing partner to do you okay, I'm going to take the first act and then I'm going to hand it to you and then you modify it. I mean, what's the process for the two of you?
Well, it's interesting. Like my first film was The Air I Breathe, which I co-wrote with director Jiho Lee. And we had an amazing first experience for both of us making a feature. Like we had Brendan Fraser and Kevin Bacon, Sarah Michelle Gellar, and this incredible cast. And we didn't know what we were doing. We got really lucky, and Jiho's a genius, and I was on fire and desperately wanting to make that movie. So we knocked that script out of the park and got this great cast. And our process was kind of not necessarily repeatable because we were making it up as we went along. More recently, I've been co-writing with another really good friend of mine, Ben Rock, and I've known Ben over 20 years. We were both aspiring filmmakers together back in Orlando. Ben got me my job at the Florida Film Festival before he went off to Sundance to help promote an independent movie he made called The Blair Witch Project. So like I had a front row seat to that blowing up and changing independent film. But so Ben and I have been friends for a long time. We've done a ton of theater together. Ben's a director mostly, and so I would write these ridiculous late night bloody comedies that he would direct, and we kind of built this aesthetic together. And so then eventually he was like, hey, I own my own gear, let's shoot a web series. I'm like, great. So we shot a horror anthology, horror comedy anthology web series called 20 Seconds to Live, which ended up playing a bunch of festivals and won awards and kind of helped us both through like a really tough time in our careers where we just weren't working. And so then after that, Ben got an opportunity to write and direct the first original podcast for Shudder, which was a kind of a a narrative horror mystery called Video Palace, and it was going to be a really fast turnaround. So because Ben and I have this kind of shorthand working together, he asked me if I wanted to co-write it with him, and I said sure. And that kind of started Ben and I off on a process of writing together. And we're not full-time writing partners because he has his own independent projects and I have mine. But we come together. We did Video Palace, and then we sold a show to Audible, which is called Catchers, which is essentially I pitch it as a monster movie for the ears, very much inspired by Tremors, but completely done in audio. And so that was Video Palace was a very fast, like 5 months from the word go to releasing it. Catchers was a 3-year labor of love, but it's like a fully produced audio movie with full cast and score and monster sound effects and all this stuff. And then now Ben and I are doing our first feature script together that we're co-writing. And I can't talk about it yet because it hasn't gone out yet. But over the course of those 3 projects, Ben and I have had to figure out a process, and it's very similar to the one I just told you about. Is like as far as like we always have a log line and we do cards on the board for sure, and then usually we do a treatment, and then especially in the audio shows, because they're episodic, Ben and I would just trade episodes. So like he'll do episode 1, I'll do 2, he'll do 3, I do 4, and we each write our own episode, and then we trade and rewrite each other's episodes, and then we put it all together, and it's a mess, and then we go through it, and then we note it up. And then sometimes we'll be like, okay, we need a completely new action scene here, and Ben will go off and write that, and I'll write a new scene here. But we're always trying to get to the place where the bones are correct, everything's kind of in its right place, and then we're just tweaking dialogue, or doing just kind of boots to the ground revision stuff. And we tried to get to a point where we could just work over Zoom and have an open document that we can both work on. And then we just take turns rewriting dialogue or pitching fixes for scenes and stuff like that. So it's always like, we're separate working on stuff, and, eventually we try to get it together where it's one draft, and then we're trying to work, side by side. And honestly, it's been really fun. It's been cool kind of creating a process that works for the two of us. And it's informed both of our like individual, I think, crafts, where like we kind of take stuff that we learned from the other person back with us to our own projects. So it's been an interesting, and it's interesting and fun just working with one of your best friends. And like, the audio stuff was brand new media that neither of us had ever worked in. So there weren't a lot of rules, and we got to make our own rules as we were going. And now we're doing a movie script, and like movies have a lot of rules. So we're learning how to write a movie together. But yeah, it's been an interesting journey, but also like we've both been storytellers for 20 years. So we brought a lot to the table, and then it was just a matter of how do we make it work together?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about writing audio fiction because I had an interview a few weeks ago with a writer who does audio drama. So,
Mhm.
so it's, theater of the mind. So
Yep.
there's probably a lot of more description, or are the character, because I always associate it with like old time radio, like, oh, come on, let's go over to the window and see what's going on. And you hear the footsteps. Is that
Yep.
what it's kind of like?
Well, that's what you try to not do, but that's usually I listen to a lot of stuff, and it's like, oh my God, I've just been shot. And what Ben and I, and it's one of the fun things about tackling this particular challenge with Ben, who's also a director. So not only do we get to write and when I say envision a story, imagine a story that we're going to have to hear, but then also because Ben's the director, we're going to figure out how to actually produce it and make it work. And so yeah, it's a really interesting medium with really interesting parameters, but I'm a big believer that parameters cause creativity. Like if you shoot super low budget film, I think, The First Evil Dead is one of my favorite indie movies ever because they just nailed a camera to some boards and ran through the woods and made really scary stuff. And they were just winging it, but they had to because they had no money. So with audio, you want to tell these stories. And Ben and I love telling very filmic stories, but we don't have a camera or costumes or set pieces or any of that stuff. So we're having to figure out how to tell our story without spoon feeding it to the audience. And so it's a lot of trial and error. And Ben and I, we figured out a process of how we like to create, audio dramas. And so our big thing is we usually like to have some sort of framing device that kind of holds the audience's hand and lets them know how to listen to the story. So in Video Palace, there was a guy actually making a podcast, and then he gets pulled into this occult mystery that he's trying to solve with his girlfriend. And so there's his narration, which what he would actually do to make his podcast, and then he'd be cutting in all the on-scene interviews he did and all this found footagey type stuff. And because Ben had worked on Blair Witch Project and helped make that movie, he's an expert at found footage stuff. So we created these sort of found footage framework with which to tell that story, but we set rules for ourselves. We tried very hard not to break those rules. But I think it's by setting those rules that forces you to be creative and come up with interesting choices. And so when it came time to do Catchers, which is much more of a straight sort of filmic, like I said, it's a monster movie for the ears. How do you do a monster movie with like full-on monster attacks and action scenes with audio? We trial and error, and we figured stuff out. And so our story is being told from the point of view of the one person that we know survived being interviewed by a state agent. And so she's telling the story, but then when we flash back to her story and things that happened in the past, it can only be from her point of view. That's an example of like one of the rules we set for ourselves. And then we're all, Ben's always like, what are the audio artifacts we can use? 911 calls, or, characters speaking over a cell phone or walkie-talkies. And so, we created a completely different sort of framework and series of challenges with Catchers. But I think, we've got really good numbers, or tons of user reviews, and almost every single review is like, this should be a movie, which was a huge compliment to us because we agree. But that's we're film lovers, so we're happy that we were able to give people an audio experience that gives them the same sort of satisfaction as if they were watching a movie, but they can just listen to it on their headphones.
That's great. So where can people so Video Palace is out. Is Catchers out, or is it about to be released?
Yeah, they're both out. Video Palace is it's through Shudder, but it's released on all podcast platforms, so you can get it on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. The main 10 episodes that's the main story, and there's a few bonus episodes after that. And then Catchers is available for subscribers. It's free for subscribers on Audible. So if you're a subscriber to Audible, please download Catchers and listen to it. We got Billy Gardell, who stars in Bob Hart's Shabishola, and Mike and Molly is our lead, and Horizon Guardiola and Mary Lane Raskab, and this incredible cast of voice actors. So yeah, I'd love it if people checked it out. I think it's a lot of fun.
All right, fantastic, Bob. This has been an amazing and so informative show. It's just a great stuff all around.
Well,
And your advice to writers, and talking about log lines, and also about and I think audio drama and audio fiction it's a lot of people aren't as aware of it. That I think it's really growing. That it's kind of like it's a slowly expanding medium. And I think the more people who get into it, I think the more they'll get into it.
I agree, 100%.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Bob. Thank you so much. Where can people find you and your works online?
Oh, geez.
Well, at least you.
What's that?
Or at least you.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm still on Twitter, like I said, in my nice little corner, where people are kind to each other. So it's a small little corner, but I'm proud of it. So I'm at ThemBob, THEM as in Mary, BOB. Them is my improv shoot from a million years ago. So at ThemBob on Twitter. I started a Substack. So I'm Bob DeRosa writer, .substack.com, I think is how it's. But if you just look for Bob DeRosa writer on Substack, I started a newsletter called All Is Not Lost. And it's kind of a play on the All Is Lost beat from Save the Cat. But I talk about my life as a screenwriter and the tough days and how I kind of wrote my way through it. And so I'm kind of getting to share some of these stories and the wins and all the losses. So you can check. Those are two places you could definitely find me. And please say hi. I love talking shop online. So
actually, yeah, I've interacted with Bob on Twitter before. He's really helpful, and he's very supportive of all writers. So definitely give him a follow. And he's a nice guy. That's what we're gonna end with. Bob DeRosa, thank you so much for being on the show today. It was just again so great and a lot of helpful stuff.
It's super fun, Paul. Thanks for inviting me.
My pleasure. Okay, well, this has been the Creative Writing Life podcast. I'm Paul Zeidman. You can check out my screenwriting blog, Maximum Z, maximumz.blog. I'm also on Twitter at maximum_Z, and I'm kind of dipping my toe every once in a while into Instagram at Pez Screenwriting, P-E-Z Screenwriting. Like you said, he's Bob. I'm Paul. This has been the Creative Writing Life podcast. Thanks for listening. Stay safe, stay healthy. Most importantly, go write something.